interesting for someone to study what is the impact of that on the countries from where we're taking these people. As I say, for the individuals, it's great. They get to migrate.
Health allocation per capita GDP in those countries from where these doctors are migrating. So that's minuscule.
How much a country is prepared to spend on health, from everything may flow from that. And so to change health, we might need to change government policy.
That the regulatory standards would be relaxed to an extent to allow foreign doctors to join in. That is the level of scarcity and the urgency.
So you make it really hard if you want to keep foreign doctors out, or you make it really easy if you want to recruit foreign doctors in. It's got nothing to do with standards. The idea that it's driven by standards is a complete and utter nonsense.
Hello and welcome again, Professor Petrosky. Thank you for your time, and we've got fantastic feedback from our program so far. You spare a lot of time. It's a volunteer effort. I really appreciate. Today's topic, a fascinating one. So when we agreed to come up with the topic and I started looking up, it seems like a discussion on a human resource strategy that is powering a clinical care system across the world, and it has its origin and roots probably in post-war scenario where the allocations, the social sector allocations boomed. Organizations like World Health Organization and United Nations, they prospered, they were developed, there was a kind of spirit. Please correct me if I'm mistaken, and take us through the change and what are the current trends emerging now in this global commodity that is a physician continues to fuel not just the demand in industrialized nations, but also the supply that is booming in the countries from where doctors are migrating to sophisticated care centers across the world.
Look, I think it's medical training and resourcing is a fascinating issue, as you say. If you look back over the last, almost 100 years as to how it has come about. I mean, in the old days of the empire, like the British Empire and the great empires, medical training was very much, developed in Western countries, particularly the United Kingdom, and, doctors were then moved from the centre of the empire, where most of them were trained in the United Kingdom, out to the furthest reaches, whether it was to India or to Africa, to Australia, Canada. The US obviously had its own system, but again had its origins, I think, in the British system. And so the developing world didn't have really a lot in the way of, if any, of medical training. It was actually the medical staffing was provided by, largely the United Kingdom, to some degree the United States for its part of the world. And then post-war, as the empire got broken up, obviously all the newly independent countries, one of the things they had to do was create their own medical systems. And along with that, so medical registration, because it was no longer centralised. For instance, pre-Second World War, Australia ran off the British system. So to become an Australian doctor, everyone was trained in Britain initially.
Right.
And that continued to be the case even once we had medical schools in Australia. British doctors were welcome to come and practice in Australia well into the 50s, until eventually Australia was confident enough essentially to shut the door and say, now everyone has to be trained locally. We saw the same happen in India. As I say, all of the newly independent countries that broke away from the empire have not only created their own medical registration systems, but progressively then built their own universities, their medical training. And then, so we sort of then, I think, saw an explosion in supply of doctors, particularly in developing countries, because they were now being trained locally. They didn't have to try and resource doctors from the United Kingdom, or places like that where there was a lot of training going on. And then as we got into the 70s and 80s, what started to happen is that the Western system, its capability to keep up with its population and with the demand for doctors, fell further and further behind. Because training doctors takes a lot of time and it's quite expensive. So,
Why?
all right. So there's two major reasons. One is demographics. That in Western countries, and I'm really talking Australia here, but it would apply to UK, US, Canada. So we all were countries that were bringing in a large number of migrants post-war. Australia, the population, doubled in like 20 or 30 years post-war because we were keen to rebuild our population, having been through the Second World War, and further grow the population, because the idea was the bigger the population, the more you can defend yourself. With a small population, if you're threatened by a country like Japan, who's much bigger, it's quite threatening. So at post-war, everyone's thinking, let's get really big really quickly. We can put more people into the armed forces. So that was one driver. And also to rebuild the country, it was realised we need lots of workers to rebuild and to move forward. But so we had this explosion of population because of migration policies.
Right.
Which meant you need more doctors because if you're used to a doctor to patient ratio of 500 to 1, people get upset if that drops to 1,000 to 1, and so that meant that technically our medical schools should have doubled in size through that period, but they didn't do that because everyone was comfortable with the same number of entrants into medical school. And again, universities don't change rapidly. Government don't pay for additional places easily. So the system has a lag. And then it takes, even when you change the system to, say, increase the intake, it's 6 years before the first intern comes out, and they're still an intern. It's 12 years before the first specialist graduates from that increase. 12 years for the first specialist. So you can double the number of people going into medical school. It will be minimum of 12 years before you see any additional specialists. 12 years. And in that time, the population has doubled again. So you so far. So that was one of the massive drivers through the 70s and 80s in the West, is that no one factored in the impact of not only a bigger population, but also then an ageing population. Because, because of the baby boomers and the births immediately post-war, those people through in 70s and 80s are now getting into their 60s and 70s. And so we have this massive surge in elderly people. And of course, elderly people need more medical care. So the whole system. And then on top of that, and of course, probably the politically incorrect thing, is that if we look at 1960s medicine in Australia and who was going into medicine, it was like 90% male and 5 to 10% female. My mother, in fact, graduated medicine in Australia in the 1930s and 1940s, sorry, and she was one of a couple of women in medicine in Australia at the time.
Fascinating.
Right. So the system was used to men who graduated and then would work their rest of their whole lives full time in the medical profession. If you had to work 80 hours a week, a man would do it. No question. Might mean that their families didn't get very good care and attention, but that was the nature of the profession. what we saw in the 80s, there was a massive push to try and increase the number of women in medicine. It was felt that there should be more of a balance. And so you see that through the 80s and 90s, there's this massive increase to the point, in fact, by the end of the 90s, the entrance into medicine ended up being 60% in some cases women and 40% men. So men became the minority. Now that was great in terms of, equal gender equality, whatever you want to. The problem no one factored in is what happens when a woman graduates medicine. She's now in her mid-20s. A lot of those women will choose to go off and get married. When they get married, they'll choose to have a baby. It's not that you can work 80 hours a week, with a newborn baby, and so they'll often, one, they'll have to have more time off, and two, they may never come back to work full time. They may choose to work part time, like my mother did, and raise a family with the rest of their time. But of course, you can't then count them as one. If you're looking at a medical workforce, you have to say, all right, well, a portion, that's equivalent of a 0.5. So we don't need to just double the numbers in medical school. If we're going to increase the proportion of women, which I think is the right thing to do, I'm not saying there was anything wrong with that, but they needed to quadruple the numbers to factor in the impact. So it really is so obvious, and yet, no one was prepared to take those hard decisions to say, to compensate for all these workforce issues, which are inevitable. And also, I guess the final one is that even men decided they wanted a better work-life balance. So whereas I was working up to 100 hours a week, as an intern and resident, if you told a young male resident today that he had to work 100 hours a week, he'd be out on strike or stress leave. There is no way that they would think that that is reasonable or accepted. And therefore, even the males in the medical profession are not working the hours that we used to work and were expected to work. So all of those things meant that they needed to multiply the entrance into medical schools maybe tenfold, and all they did was increase them maybe 50%. So too little, too late, and too slow, because again, it was going to take so many decades for anything to actually result in more doctors. So what they then did is said, okay, let's strip all the doctors out of the developing world. So this now gets into real geopolitics. So Australia hasn't spent the money and invested in educating its own doctors to have enough doctors. Let's steal all the doctors from India and Pakistan and everywhere in the world which is poor and is short of doctors. Well, they've already trained their people, so let's offer them a bribe and give them immigration and pay them a good salary. And so ruthlessly we stole, doctors who were vital to those developing countries, and unapologetically just stole them and recruited them to work in Australia to make up for the deficiencies in the number of doctors we're training, which, in a public health sense is scandalous. It's just stealing intellectual capital from the countries that need it most because you have more money and you can pay more. And of course, you can't blame the individual doctors. Who wouldn't want to come and have a great life in Australia rather than slave away and earn a very modest income in India or Pakistan or one of these other developing countries? So again, public health is one thing, but government policy is often the very opposite. It's very selfish, it's very local, and it's centred around local. And we're now seeing the same happen with the US, where they similarly are now waking up to the fact they don't have enough doctors. So what are they doing? Rather than training more, investing in their own workforce, they're in the process of looking to steal doctors from the developing world. So, the same tricks go on. But unfortunately, that's a challenge, if you're trying to improve public health in developing countries. Because how do they compete? They certainly can't pay the salaries that a developed country can.
Back in the day, the USMLE standards seemed to be like cast in stone, but I just came across a news clipping that said that uh, in some parts or in some states, they're kind of exempting the MLE requirements. Sounds impossible to me, but these kind of things continue to get reported, that the regulatory standards would be relaxed to an extent to allow foreign doctors to join in. That is the level of scarcity
Yeah.
and the urgency.
Yeah, that's what you have to. Same in Australia. I mean, we had some of the strictest rules,
Very rigorous.
keeping foreign doctors out. As I mentioned, even British doctors no longer became automatically accepted in Australia. Through the 60s and 70s, progressively they shut down all doctors, even from Western countries. And similarly the US, and other countries. And of course, what you realise is medical registration it's not actually an academic exercise; it's a political exercise.
Mm.
So you make it really hard if you want to keep foreign doctors out, or you make it really easy if you want to recruit foreign doctors in. It's got nothing to do with standards. The idea that it's driven by standards is a complete and utter nonsense. Because, and as you say, that's why it can flip from one day to the next. It will be no doctor trained overseas is at our standard, to, oh no, actually we now accept that they're all should be allowed to work here. Australia did the same thing, as I say, from the 1980s progressively onwards, dropped all of those rules and standards in order to steal all of these doctors from developing countries because, politically that's what they wanted to achieve. So we play around this idea of standards and everything, but it ultimately it's all politically driven.
Putting the shoe on the other foot of the supply side, developing countries, which are disproportionately the South Asian country, because as you recollected, the history has a lot to do with the English speaking countries and the supply of doctor to the nations that predominantly speak English, and supplied by those nations which have the institutions developed by the British system. So they continue to have English as their primary medium of instructions and medical knowledge and research as well. So the developed countries, having experienced all my work experience over there, seem to be pretty satisfied with that kind of arrangement as well. That their argument is that because they're developing, most of them are in debt over the period of time. They have accumulated certain debt,
Yep.
and now they rely on those foreign remittances, which are increasingly being sent abroad from. So it's like it's like an addiction that is working both ways.
Look, yeah, and absolutely, as I say, I mean, it's the way it is. And, if a country knowingly, say, let's take, for instance, a country where I know this is the case, say Cuba, which has a small population, about 10 million. So they have deliberately created more medical schools and graduate more doctors than Cuba needs. Knowing that there are all these countries in South America that don't have doctors or can't supply sufficient well-trained doctors. And so all those countries of South America, you'll find the doctors are all Cuban trained. Mm-hmm. So Cuba has deliberately, not to lose doctors that it desperately needs, it actually has created a system where it trains more doctors than it needs for its own population and then provides that as a global resource. Now, if India or Pakistan, took that model, then you wouldn't say Australia is stealing, their medical manpower. But what we know is that those countries don't have a massive supply of doctors if you look at the ratio of doctors to the population. So taking doctors out of that system is stealing, important local intellectual capital. Now, of course, you can't blame the individuals, for wanting to move to a better life and higher incomes. And of course, yes, there may be collateral benefits where, some of their earnings, then flow back to their native country, to their families, and so it has a positive benefit that way. But still, it leaves that country short of doctors, unless they are overtraining doctors, knowing, factoring that into their equations. But generally, that's not the case that I'm aware of. Apart from, as I say, Cuba is a unique example. But again, it has a small population. So it's relatively easy for them to serve that population with enough doctors and still have more doctors in excess of that to share with South America.
As we move towards the wrap-up, do you see this ecosystem of demand and supply of foreign medical graduates from low and middle-income countries towards more industrialized nations changing anytime soon?
Not really, because for the reasons I've said before, we've never built our medical schools to cater to the current demand, let alone future demand. And demand is going to keep rising because of the aging population. So
No.
So it means for the foreseeable future, no, we'll have to keep stealing doctors from the developing world. And there may be more competition. I mean, if US throws its doors open, they could suck in probably, every doctor trained in India. I don't know the numbers, but the US is a big place. So if they really are in the process of seriously, as I say, recruiting and attracting those people, it could even impact on Australia, because we used to being able to steal, because we don't need massive numbers. It's probably like hundreds to thousands a year. But if the US starts trying to steal hundreds of thousands a year of doctors from those countries, like, how do we even compete? So it may impact on us, interestingly, because it's a competition. And so I think, I think not only is it going to continue, but it's possible it's going to get far worse. Because, as I say, particularly if the US decide to go down that path, which it does look like they are doing, then they'll be looking for large numbers, just because of their sheer size.
Dr. Petrosky, what a fascinating discussion. I think not just between us, but I'm sure it's going to attract some comments, because so much of the uncertainties and anxieties while one is graduating. And it's not just the doctor who is graduating or the student, it's the entire family behind him who are, waiting for him to graduate and take whatever legacy, or to, carve a new niche, become a specialist, or move abroad. So this kind of discussion was so much needed, I feel.
And similarly, it's not just the family. I mean, the investment in doctors. I think a lot of these countries, because they don't all charge. I mean, the question is, does any country charge fully to train a doctor? To get a doctor through that 15 years to the point where they, are fully trained. What's it cost? The country. And the answer is millions of dollars. I mean, that's why places like Australia don't want to train too many, because they've realised the true cost is massive. And so each time a country loses a doctor that they've trained, it's unlikely that they've charged that person in fees what it's cost. And that means each doctor they lose, maybe they're losing $3 million of intellectual capital that they have created. And, if that's a few people, it's neither here nor there. But if we're talking hundreds of thousands, suddenly that's an economic drain on a whole country that, is going to impact their economy. And, that needs to be thought about, I think, in all of these dynamics. But the important thing is each country should train enough doctors for its population. They need policies and they need to ensure that should be the responsibility, I think, for every country. But unfortunately, some countries don't carry their weight when it comes to the medical workforce. They prefer to. And same with nurses. Australia now is taking hundreds of thousands of nurses from the Philippines.
Right.
It's
an important part of the...
so every second nurse in our hospital will be from the Philippines. What's that doing to the Philippines? We don't care. We just need them. So we'll do this. It is quite ruthless, and it would be interesting for someone to study what is the impact of that on the countries from where we're taking these people. As I say, for the individuals, it's great. They get to migrate to potentially a wealthier, more comfortable society. But what is the impact it's leaving back where they came from?
I think the answer to that, in part at least, lies in the GDP allocation per capita, health allocation per capita GDP in those countries from where these doctors are migrating. So that's minuscule. So when you have that situation, no matter how much you spend on training a doctor, it's going to be very hard to retain them because the system is not offering sufficient rewards and, of course, the mental peace to make a career and to make a life within those countries. It doesn't take too long to just maybe run any search and see that several of these countries from where doctors are going have less than, even in some cases, less than 1% of health spending per capita of the GDP. So that situation, as you said, doesn't augur well, and it's not going to change. It's
hopefully, you hope that as countries move up, they spend more as a percentage of their GDP on health. But you're right, it doesn't necessarily follow.
Professor, at the policy level, it almost becomes a food fight. So the health has arrived at that level of fraction because it kept losing grounds to other sectors over the decades. Yeah. And when you inflation adjust all the salaries in health sector, so actually those social sectors have probably regressed compared to so many other sectors.
These are all things that I think need deep discussion. Why do countries spend such a high percentage of GDP on the military? What's more important, the health of the population or having, nuclear missiles? And, unfortunately, health is not appreciated necessarily enough. So maybe all the problems start with economics, as you say, and how much a country is prepared to spend on health. From everything may flow from that. And so to change health, we might need to change government policy. So interesting discussion for a future day.
Fantastic. I think it's again one reference to the books, and I just cannot be thankful to you for your time again, and we appreciate discussing with you.